The Syrian civil war has reignited again. Rebel groups, competing factions, a government in retreat. For years, the battle lines remained frozen, but in a surprise new offensive, rebel forces have taken two major cities and are continuing to push deep into regime-held territory. We're going to look at what happened, who's fighting who, and how a complicated tangle of international politics and alliances mean this conflict has become a proxy war with global implications. This is the new front in Syria's war, explained. I'm back again with another explainer about conflict in the Middle East. Last time I was talking about Israel and Hezbollah, and both of them are involved again this time. But in this video, we're not talking about Lebanon, we're talking about the country that borders it. Syria's war re-erupted in the final days of November when rebel forces based in the northwest launched a surprise offensive and very quickly captured most of government-held Aleppo city. That was huge. It meant rebels had taken over Syria's second largest city, when for the last 4 years the conflict had been more or less dormant. But how did the war in Syria start in the first place? It began in 2011 when countries across the Middle East rose up against their authoritarian leaders, a movement known as the Arab Spring. Syrians took to the streets in peaceful protest against President Bashar al-Assad, whose family has ruled Syria since the 1970s. Assad's government used deadly force to crush the dissent. As the unrest spread, the crackdown intensified and opposition supporters took up arms. The violence quickly escalated and the country descended into a bloody civil war. The regime's brutal force, such as the large-scale shelling of civilian areas and use of chemical weapons, ultimately meant that the Syrian government effectively won the war. Millions were killed or displaced, and the conflict effectively opened the door to the Islamic State, or ISIS. The terror group took advantage of the turmoil and control of nearly a third of the country at one point. ISIS were eventually beaten back by a coalition of forces backed by the US, but the war in Syria has never really ended, which brings us back to today. So who is fighting who in Syria right now? Since 2020, Assad's forces have controlled most of the country. Various opposition groups and rebels held onto parts of the north and a pocket in the south. A Kurdish-led group known as the Syrian Democratic Forces control a large swathe of the northeast. Turkish-backed rebels hold parts of the north, while the Islamic State has been reduced to a few small pockets of control. And then we have the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They control this area in the northwest and are based in Idlib. It's this group who have spearheaded the new offensive. In a matter of days, HTS were able to seize Aleppo and continued their advance south, taking control of many villages along the way and then seizing another major city, Hama, as they now march towards Homs, which is around 100 miles north of the capital, Damascus. The US, UN and others designate the Islamist group as a terror organization. Its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, is an ex-ISIS member who formerly swore allegiance to Al-Qaeda. He broke from both groups, rejecting transnational jihadism, and committed himself to Syria, and was the mastermind behind the latest assault.
My contacts with people on the ground have revealed that the groups have told them months ago that there will be an attack.
And it came at a time when the Syrian government was ill-prepared and ill-equipped.
The sort of pro-Syrian regime security apparatus was super fragile. It was very, very delicate, and it got sent into complete chaos and disarray as soon as they came under a quite sophisticated attack.
As effective as the HTS advance has been, the government was able to respond with airstrikes. An Assad tactic throughout this war has been to target civilian infrastructure, and he's doing it again. Attacks on hospitals in Aleppo and the HTS stronghold of Idlib have intensified, with doctors in Idlib saying health services have come to a halt. So that's the situation right now. But let's step back. Why was it, after years of relative calm, that this conflict has sparked back to life? And it's at this point things get more complicated, because the answers lie beyond the borders of Syria. No group fighting in Syria is doing it without support from outside, and international powers from across the world have been involved in this conflict since the beginning. The airstrikes in Idlib are being carried out by Russian planes, because Vladimir Putin has long been a staunch ally of President Assad. Iran and its proxy in Lebanon, Hezbollah, have provided fighters and military support to Assad for many years. But Assad has problems with those allies right now. Hezbollah has just agreed a delicate ceasefire with Israel after more than a year of fighting that severely depleted their military strength. The HDS's attack on Aleppo coincided with the start of that ceasefire in Lebanon, and reports say Hezbollah has no plans to send fighters to help Assad's army. And while Iranian-backed militias have crossed the border from Iraq to support Assad, the country is still preoccupied with its ongoing conflict with Israel.
רגע, אנחנו בהפסקת אש, אני מציין, אנחנו בהפסקת אש, לא בסיום המלחמה.
But what about its biggest ally outside of the Middle East, Russia? When the war was at its peak, it was Vladimir Putin's air power that proved pivotal in Assad's victory over the rebels. That in turn gave Moscow a foothold in the Middle East. Remember, Putin wants Russia to be a major global power, and Syria gives them air bases as well as their only naval port in the Mediterranean. But again, things are different now. Putin has been waging a war in Ukraine for nearly 3 years, occupying most of his ground forces, air power, and attention. It took days for Moscow to respond to the latest attack in Aleppo, and Russia has withdrawn some ships from Syrian naval bases. All this means that Assad can't rely on the same level of military support from his allies. That fragility is partly why HDS has made such dramatic gains so quickly. Their success has even taken them by surprise.
I think their goals have changed from the beginning. They were surprised later on that it was super easy to capture areas and reach all the way to Aleppo, capture Aleppo and continue.
So the Syrian regime is on the back foot with limited support from its allies right now. And they're in uncharted territory. The capture of Hama is the first time the city has fallen from government control since the war began in 2011.
This is a truly existential threat for this regime. And I think they realize that. I think their allies realize that. But also, I think the rebels are very much convinced that they can put enough pressure on this regime to potentially lead it to collapse entirely.
With everything in the balance, a lot of what happens next in Syria depends on what happens outside of Syria. So let's introduce a new country, Turkey. President Erdogan is using the fighting to push for a deal to get Syrian refugees who came to Turkey during the war out of his country. And he wants to put pressure on what he considers terrorist forces on his border. Erdogan thinks Russia will back him to come to an agreement with Assad on that. But those terrorist forces are actually the SDF, a Kurdish-led force who helped defeat the Islamic State. The SDF's main backers are the United States.
We've been clear that the campaign is not over. ISIS or Daesh remains a significant threat.
Another group tasked with keeping ISIS under control. Washington wants to keep it that way. In fact, the SDF have already withdrawn fighters from the front lines to prevent getting caught up in the latest round of fighting. And don't forget that the isolationist President Trump is coming back into power soon. Last time he was in office, he withdrew US troops from Syria. Could he do that again? What this all shows is that there are no obvious answers to ending the fighting. And that's not good for Syria.
I am not predicting the future being rosy, unfortunately, for at least the short term in Syria.
What this latest fighting in Syria does show is just how interconnected conflicts around the world are right now. It's a complicated patchwork of competing factions, fighters, and international interests. In a world with wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Syria, what happens on the front lines of one has consequences on the others, making the next steps difficult to predict. But whatever happens next, we'll be here to cover it. So subscribe to get the latest news from around the world. And if you want a deep dive into the recent Lebanon ceasefire deal, then you can watch that here too.